Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for today, April 6, 2021. I'm going to bring you a report of an extremely dangerous and worrisome development which is occurring in Europe between Ukraine and Russia, which is being cheered on by the Biden administration, by the forces of NATO and the European Union, who are encouraging Ukraine to press ahead against the Russian ethnic people who live in eastern Ukraine to, in a sense, provoke the Russians with full support of the United States and NATO. Now, when I say this is dangerous, as you'll see from the report, it's extremely dangerous. There are troop movements inside Russia, which the Russians say are their annual military exercises. Ukraine is going to be involved in at least 5 military exercises, including with NATO countries over the next weeks and months. So there have been some skirmishes at the border. The Ukrainians claim that 4 Ukrainian soldiers were killed by the Russians. The people in the independent republics in eastern Ukraine claim that they have been shot at and had drone targets sent against them, including one that killed a young girl. So the confrontation is escalating. Now, this is part of an overall escalation coming from the NATO forces, coming from the Biden administration, but it's a continuation of what was going on in the last year of the Trump administration. Remember, Trump came to office with an intention to completely dismantle the war party in both parties, the war hawks, the neoconservatives, the ones who are tied to the military-industrial complex. He came into office promising to shut that down. And he made an effort, to make arrangements to work with President Putin for cooperation. But it was sabotaged by the intelligence community, the Brennans, the Clappers, the Susan Rices, the Obama team, coordinated with the United Kingdom, British intelligence, and with NATO, to sabotage Trump's intention. And then some of Trump's own appointees, including John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, Esper, the defense secretary, engaged in activity that as well ramped up the threats of war as opposed to moving toward ending the endless wars. So it's a dangerous moment today. As I mentioned, you've had reports of skirmishes in recent days. You had a talk between President Biden and President Zelensky, followed up by Defense Secretary Austin, the man from Raytheon, talking with Taran, who is the Ukrainian defense minister. And in that talk, according to the Defense Department, Austin pledged unwavering U.S. support for Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and Euro-Atlantic aspirations, unquote. Euro-Atlantic aspirations means Ukraine wants to join NATO. Now, the idea of NATO having forces on Russia's western border has been a red line ever since the February 2014 coup. Now, the Russian Foreign Ministry issued a statement saying, while NATO claims its purpose is securing peace, look at the recent history, going back to the bombing of Yugoslavia, the invasion and destruction of Iraq, the invasion and destruction of Libya, the role of the U.S. forces in Syria. And it says that this tells a different story. These events tell a different story than the idea of seeking peace. And they say that the comments from Western leaders to encourage the Ukrainians that they'll have full backup of NATO and the United States, these comments are, quote, unleashing delusions of grandeur in Kiev. Now, let me just point out that Biden is no newcomer to Ukraine aspirations for NATO and EU joining. Biden was the point man for the Obama administration in Ukraine. He worked very closely with Victoria Nuland, who is the on-site supervisor for the U.S. of the Maidan coup in February 2014, a coup in which the United States put itself on the side of neo-Nazi units of the Azov Battalion and the Banderistas in supporting the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych. in a coup, a regime change coup, which included deadly violence that was unleashed in the Maidan square. Biden has a history of coordination of activity in Ukraine. I'll just give you an example. A speech he gave at the Atlantic Council in April 30th, 2014. So just 2.5 months after the Ukraine coup. Biden was speaking before the Atlantic Council, which is funded by the military-industrial complex. It's one of these NATO think tanks whose purpose is to support war and confrontation and military buildup. Biden gave a talk called Toward a Europe Whole and Free. And he said that the current crisis, referring to the Russian warnings against Ukraine activity against Russian citizens and Russian ethnic population in eastern Ukraine, that Russia said they would defend them if necessary, Biden said, this crisis has nothing to do with the enlargement of NATO. It was born in the Kremlin. It was born in Putin's mind. This is coherent with Biden's recent comments that he believes Putin is a killer. But what actually was the cause of this confrontation? It was the coup that was fully backed, as Nuland said, by $5 billion from the United States government. That's what raised the alarm signals in Moscow. Now, Biden went on to describe himself as a proud Atlanticist, in other words, totally committed to the transatlantic military operations, a firm believer that NATO and the transatlantic relationship have never been more relevant than they are today. And he said at that time that the U.S. is reaffirming its commitment under Article 5 of the NATO treaty in response to Russian aggression. What was the Russian aggression? That they were concerned with the attacks against people in Donetsk and the Donbass region who were being assaulted by the Ukrainian military, by a Ukrainian Defense Department who had among its leaders absolute open neo-Nazis, such as Andriy Parubiy, who was defended at the time by one of Biden's top officials, Michael Carpenter, who praised Parubiy as a dynamic, important figure. So this relationship of Joe Biden and his team with neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian defense forces and using Ukraine to poke a stick in the eye of the Russians goes back long before the coup in 2014. And so when you hear that Ukraine is participating in 5 upcoming NATO military exercises, including one called Cossack Mace 2021, the Ukrainian military commander-in-chief, General Komchak, said the armed forces of Ukraine have become a real shield of Europe. A shield for what? Russian malign intent? Now, we've seen also one U.S. military figure after another go before the Congress, asking for more money, more resources, denouncing Russia and China as malign actors. Admiral Fowler, the head of the U.S. Southern Command, was one of the more recent ones toward the end of March. Fowler told the Congress, the hemisphere in which we live, that is North America, is under assault. The democratic principles and values that bind us together are being actively undermined. And what did he say was undermining those values? The Chinese economic cooperation going on with countries in South and Central America, that they're building ports, they're building infrastructure, they're making loans, what they deride as vaccine diplomacy. While the United States is doing nothing to provide vaccines to these countries, China and Russia have made offers, including with Cuba. That's a malign intent to help nations defend their populations from a pandemic, to lift their populations out of poverty. That's a malign intent. The actual malign intent is Biden's role in the coup in Honduras that brought a drug gang into power. The U.S. policy under the War Party to keep these nations poor and under the control of the International Monetary Fund. So this is a warning to those of you who are awake and watching the situation develop, The leadership of the United States, previously under Pompeo, Esper, and other war hawks, and now under the Biden team, is carrying out provocations, whether it's in Eastern Europe or in the South China Sea, that could lead to a war. And this war party has to be shut down. And this should not be allowed to continue, because if it does, there's no guarantee, as the Russians are warning, that we could end up in a war by miscalculation that could become a nuclear war. So that's my report for this morning. I'll be with you again tomorrow.